John B. Thompson is Emeritus Professor of Sociology at the University of Cambridge and Emeritus Fellow of Jesus College, Cambridge. His previous books include Merchants of Culture. He has just written a book entitled Book Wars, the Digital Revolution in Publishing. And this book tells the story of the turbulent decade when the book publishing industry collided with the great technological revolution of our time. From the surge of ebooks to the self-publishing explosion and the growing popularity of audiobooks, this book provides a comprehensive and fine-grained account of technological disruption in one of our most important and successful creative industries. Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Okay, I'm going to start with a couple of observations, big observations from reading your book, and I'd like to get your feedback on those, please. So, number one, publishers used to be booksellers, many of them at least, back in the 18th and 19th century. They hand sold readers. They knew readers. They slowly separated so that publishers then started selling to booksellers rather than readers directly. And jump ahead a couple of centuries, technology has enabled Amazon to step in, to learn a lot about those readers, their buying and browsing habits, collect user data, and make recommendations. In other words, electronically hand sell. And they've dominated retail. So what publishers need to do now is to reconnect with readers.
You put your finger on a central point and a central theme of the book. So the line of argument you've just sketched is a line of argument that I spend quite a bit of time developing in the book, and you've expressed it very, very clearly. What's happened over the last couple of centuries is that publishers have effectively come to think of themselves as B2B businesses, to use the terminology of business studies. That is, they see themselves as selling primarily to other businesses, that is, to retailers and wholesalers. And they leave it to the retailers and wholesalers to make their books available to the ultimate customer, the reader, and to drive sales with consumers. Publishers situate themselves further back in the supply chain as B2B organizations. And this model, which has structured the book publishing industry for centuries, has worked fairly well for publishers because they'd never really needed to know much about the ultimate customer, the reader, so long as the intermediaries in the book supply chain, that is, the booksellers, were doing a good job of presenting their books to readers and driving demand. But this model began to break down with the digital revolution. And this is one of the most fundamental transformative impacts of the digital revolution on the book publishing industry, though it is not so visible to outsiders. The model began to break down because, on the one hand, many booksellers began to go out of business in the early stages of the digital revolution. This was partly the result of the rise of Amazon in the 1990s and early 2000s. Amazon turned out to be a very effective marketing operation for books, and it gained market share very, very quickly, often at the expense of traditional bricks and mortar booksellers. And so you saw many booksellers going out of business. The small independent booksellers were driven out of business in the 1990s and early 2000s, partly by the rise of Amazon and partly by the large bookselling chains like Barnes & Noble and Borders. But then the large bookselling chains themselves came under increasing pressure, in part from the rise of Amazon. And you see this development reaching its climax with the collapse of Borders around 2010. Suddenly, overnight, a very large number of bookstores went out of business. And now publishers found that the intermediaries that they were relying on to put their books before readers and sell them to readers were diminishing in number very dramatically. On the other hand, more and more of the business of publishers was being channeled through a new emerging retailer that was operating in a very, very different way. The thing about Amazon is not just that it became a very powerful retailer in the book industry, but also, and perhaps even more importantly, that the nature of its power was different. It built its power on the basis of gathering data about consumers. And other booksellers in the past had not done that. Barnes and Noble and Borders and small independent booksellers were not systematically gathering data about their consumers.
Mhm.
But Amazon was. Right from the beginning, in the mid 1990s, it knew that because it was an online operation, it was selling online. In order to buy from Amazon, you have to give your customer details to Amazon. They collected all this information, and moreover, they also collected everything you did on their platform. So if you visited a book and looked at a book, they knew that you were doing that, and they retained that information. They gathered this data systematically and turned it into a new kind of resource which they could use to strengthen their position in the retail space. Because now they knew a great deal about readers and what kinds of books they were interested in. And therefore, they could use this knowledge to promote in a very targeted way to their readers. So that's why, as a Amazon user, you will receive daily emails or several emails a week, which are recommending books to you on the basis of your previous purchasing and browsing behavior. This was an extremely powerful and effective marketing operation, and it put Amazon in an altogether different place compared to traditional booksellers, even compared to the large bookselling chains like Barnes and Noble.
This is the kind of knowledge that really good booksellers had in their head. And what Amazon has done is basically digitized all of that.
Yes, but also they are able to do it at scale in a
Yeah,
way that traditional booksellers could never do. So
yeah,
the traditional bookseller, your small bookseller on a high street, for example, might welcome John Doe who walks in the shop and say, John, I've got a great book for you because I know you really love books about World War One. And there's a new book about World War One I'd really like to show you. Now, they can do that on an individual basis, but they can't do it on scale. They can't do it with
no.
tens of thousands and millions of consumers. They can do it with a handful of patrons of their store. And that's a very important function that they still provide.
But you know what? Amazon cannot replicate that wonderful human connection.
You're absolutely right about that. And that's why there still is a very important space for booksellers, especially for the independent booksellers who understand the importance of locale, of localism, that is, being part of a local community, and who understand the importance of personal relationships that are cultivated over time with people who visit their bookstore regularly. And the successful independent bookstores are the ones who understand the value of the local community and those personal connections with regular customers. And they cultivate them and they make a real effort to meet the needs of the local community for which they are catering. And that is a very important role of a local bookstore, which has not gone away, and indeed has begun to stage something of a recovery in recent years for exactly that reason. The large bookseller like Amazon, especially one relying on very abstract mechanisms of promotion like algorithmic recommendation, is never going to replicate the personal touch of a local bookseller. I think these are complementary processes. Having said all that, going back to the original point, book publishers began to realize that with the decline of physical bricks on mortar bookstores and with the rise of a very powerful new retailer operating in a very different way with large quantities of knowledge about readers, publishers were in a new world, and they could no longer rely on the old model, which allowed them to outsource the activity of reaching out to readers to the booksellers. Of course, Amazon were going to do this in their own way, but this was entirely within Amazon's control. And if Amazon decided that they didn't want to recommend the books of a particular publisher, there's not much that publisher could do about it. So
Right.
publishers now realized that this old B2B model was not serving them very well, indeed was really working against them. And they began to think about how to come up with a different way of understanding themselves as a publishing organization, no longer just a B2B business, but also more and more a B2C business. That is, one that was oriented not just to retailers, but also to the ultimate customer, the reader.
Mm-hmm.
The challenge was how to do that, especially since by the time they realized it, Amazon was already a huge organization which had gathered far more data on customers than any individual publisher would ever be able to gather.
That's the other challenge, is that Amazon is a one-stop shop, so you can get all the books there, whereas individual publishers obviously can only provide access to their own books.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And so that meant, from the consumer point of view, there were many attractions of using Amazon. Partly, as you say, because it's a one-stop shop. You can get any book you like on Amazon, plus many other things apart
Plus
from
the price.
Plus the price, because they discount aggressively. So it's the variety, the price, but also excellent customer service. There's no question about it. You know, they are very fast. They deliver very quickly. They don't charge you for the delivery. So there are many enormous attractions to buying books from Amazon. And so, you know, one has to recognize that Amazon do a wonderful job as a retail organization. And it's very, very hard for any publisher to match that. But this is the key point. The challenge for publishers is not to try to match it. There's no need for publishers to sell their books directly to consumers. That's not the point. The point is to be able to reach out to consumers, to engage with them about the books that they are publishing. Because a publisher needs to increasingly to think of themselves as part of a community, if we can put it that way. They are publishing in certain areas, and there are many people in the world who are interested in those areas where they are publishing. And the question is, how can publishers engage directly with the thousands, maybe even millions of people who are interested in the kinds of books that they are publishing? Not that the publisher has to sell to them. They don't. They can leave it to Amazon or to Barnes and Noble or to an independent bookstore or to some other organization to do the selling. But they need to be able to engage with readers as part of a dialogue and part of a process of discussion and exploration about the kinds of topics that they are publishing on.
They have to sell the books, though. Ultimately, that's what their objective is, though, of course.
Yes, they do, but they don't have to have a hard sell line. That is, it's one thing to be doing direct marketing, just the hard sell, buy this book. It's quite another to build up a community. It can be a very large community, can be hundreds of thousands of individuals who might be interested in knowing about some of the books that you're publishing and why those books are interesting, or who, even more interestingly, might wish to have a conversation with the author, facilitated by the publisher. You know, again, here, publishers could learn something from those local bookstores. One thing that local bookstores do is to bring authors in for author events. Well, publishers are in a great position to do exactly the same thing, especially in this new digital age, where having those author events doesn't have to be done in a particular physical locale. It can be done online. There can be ways of virtual engagement that enable readers to engage directly with authors or listen to authors, facilitated by the publisher.
Yeah. And I know Faber's doing a very good job of that right now.
That's right. I mean, many publishers are exploring these options now. This is the one of the new opportunities opened up by the digital revolution that enables publishers no longer to think of themselves as just B2B businesses, but as organizations that are essentially intermediaries in a dialogue between authors and readers.
Yeah.
And they can facilitate that dialogue. And facilitating that dialogue will also help them to sell the books, because readers engaging with authors will be interested in buying their books and reading their books. And this can become a constructive interplay of dialogue and book reading. And publishers increasingly have understood that there are opportunities here as well as necessities which they must deal with.
Okay, second big observation. The reading experience is pretty well unimprovable, if you ask me, and many others. You only require a legible text, uninterrupted quiet, no distractions, time to think and imagine, jot down a few notes, make a few pencil markings. Other media or augmentation requires separate space and time for different kind of attention and interaction. And I'm not sure that and you go through all sorts of wonderful examples of attempts to augment the reading experience when it really isn't augmentable or designed to be augmented.
Well, I think that's a great observation. Again, let me step back a little bit to situate that observation in a broader context. In many ways, your observation is a great conclusion of a long and complicated history. And that long and complicated history looks a bit like this: that when the digital revolution began to collide with traditional media industries, beginning with music and other industries, it began to turn those industries upside down by enabling a new kind of consumer experience and a new way of delivering media products to consumers. So music is a good example of that. You know, the traditional vinyl LP was one way of delivering music to consumers, but it required a rather elaborate turntable in order to play it. It had great limitations because it could scratch the LP and therefore damage it very easily, and so on and so forth. And fidelity was not particularly high. So the digital transformation enabled much higher quality consumer experiences to be created rather quickly through various.
That is debatable. It
is debatable. I know it is debatable, but let's not get bogged down in that debate. But with CDs, and then ultimately with MP3 files and downloadable music listening on Spotify, et cetera, there was a process of rapid change and transformation and a very, very large migration to these new media, of music consumption. No doubt about that. Now, there are people who would still argue that the vinyl LP remains a very valuable and indeed a superior form of music consumption, but they are frankly a minority. And the vast majority of people consuming music now do so in digital ways. So there has been an enormous shift. Now, when the digital revolution began to affect the book publishing industry in the late 1990s and early 2000s, there were many in the book publishing industry that thought the transformation in book publishing would go the same way as the transformation in music. And there would be also a eclipse of traditional printed book and its replacement by digital forms of book consumption. The ebook being the prime example of that. And so, I was interviewing people throughout the early 2000s, and there was a deeply held conviction throughout the industry at that time that this was the fate of the book industry, that it would go the same way as the music industry. There were very few people who disagreed strongly with the view that books would be eclipsed to some extent, and maybe even to a large extent, by digital forms of reading and book consumption. And indeed, when the Kindle was eventually launched into the American market in November 2007, and it took off very, very quickly, and ebook sales rocketed in the next 2 to 3 years, it did look to many people in the industry like this was the book publishing industry's iPod moment. That is, that books too were going to be eclipsed by ebooks, and the traditional print on paper book would become almost a collector's item. Now, that view really was pretty widespread around 2010, 2011, 2012, when ebook sales were rocketing. But then something very surprising happened, which is that ebook sales just stopped around 2012, 2013, began to plateau and then to fall off. At around the same time, in the years 2008, 2009, 2010, there were many experiments with new forms of book creation and consumption, which you alluded to a moment ago. That is, many organizations and individuals who were asking themselves, what should a book be in the digital age? That is, we've taken it for granted that a book is roughly 250, 300 pages long, that is basically text, maybe some illustrations, but not very different from that. But why does a book have to be like that? It's like that only because we have to print it on paper and bind it in some binding and sell it as a finite physical object. But if we take away that limitation of having to be printed on paper, we could create books in very different ways. We could introduce lots of other multimedia features like audio and video and many other interesting characteristics that could be added to a book, such as the ability for the author to influence the outcome, of the reader to influence the outcome by choosing different pathways as they read the book, and so on and so forth. So many experiments were launched in around 2008, 2010, 2012 to create new types of book.
You point to a successful one with Faber and the Wasteland.
Yes. So one of the most interesting of these organizations was a organization based in London called Touch Press, which was perhaps the Rolls-Royce of these different organizations. They were creating fantastic books as apps using multimedia, and of course invested a lot in doing it and produced beautiful apps. So one of the ones they produced was the one with Faber, which was a app version of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. And it is an absolutely wonderful app to immerse yourself in, because not only can you read The Wasteland, but you can listen to it being read by numerous different readers and narrators, including T.S. Eliot as well as others. And you can watch it being read as a performance by Fiona Shaw, and so on and so forth. So it is a very rich experience. And then there's a lot of supplementary material that you can dip into as well. So it's a very rich multimedia experience. And so, one might say that, well, these are more interesting and engaging ways of reading than just sitting down with a print on paper book. What happened, however, historically, was that these attempts to create different kinds of books structured as apps or as digitally enriched ebooks never really succeeded. The organizations that created them were just not viable. And so after doing wonderful things like Touch Press did and many others did, these organizations folded. Most of them folded. They simply couldn't sustain themselves because they were not generating sufficient revenue through the sale of their digital products to cover their costs. And so they became unsustainable as organizations. Moreover, the ebook, which was basically a replica of the print book, but simply sold as a digital product read on a Kindle or other reading device, began to plateau around 2012, 2013, and didn't really increase beyond about, on average, 20 to 25% of overall sales. So the print book remained the cornerstone of the book publishing industry. So that was unexpected by most people in the industry. It means that the book publishing industry, despite all appearances to the contrary, did not actually have the same course of development as the music industry. It just didn't develop in the same way because, and this comes back to your original point, the reading experience and the consumer experience was not the same for books as it was for music. For many people, reading a book, a print on paper book, is a very good consumer experience. And many people prefer to read a book on a printed page than to read it on a screen, especially if it is something a little more complicated, not just a novel, but a nonfiction book which has rather more complicated argument to it, or which maybe has graphs or tables in it, or something of that kind. Many people will prefer to read that as a printed book rather than to read it as a screen-based ebook.
That brings up an interesting observation of yours, and that is that the sales of ebooks varied by genre quite significantly.
That's absolutely right. So the most people who were exploring the pathway, the trajectory of ebooks, simply looked at average percentages. That is, the percentage that ebooks represented of the total sale of publishers. And what you saw, if you looked at the average number, was that ebooks began to plateau at around 20 to 25% of total retail sales of trade publishers, of American trade publishers. However, if you then dug below the surface a bit and looked at what happened to the sales of ebooks for different types of books, you see an enormous variation. So the figure of 20 to 25% is really rather misleading here. It obscures this extraordinary differentiation of patterns that you see when you disaggregate the numbers. And what you see when you disaggregate the numbers is that some types of books have sold and continue to sell very, very well as ebooks. And these in particular are the genre fiction books, especially romance.
Yeah.
Romance probably sells, even today, 50% or more of its sales are as ebooks. But also sci-fi, mystery, thriller, etc. Genre fiction sells probably between 40 and 50% in ebook format. And then even literary fiction sells quite substantial numbers as ebooks, maybe slightly less than genre fiction, but still significant numbers, maybe 30 to 40% in that region.
The prediction was it was going to be business books.
Yes, that's right. In the early 2000s, most people were predicting it would be business books that would be the type of book that would spearhead the digital ebook revolution. But in fact, at the end of the day, it was romance novels.
Yeah.
And of course, the larger proportion, in terms of readers, it's female readers are the predominant readers of romance fiction. So it wasn't business books read by businessmen in airport lounges at all that spearheaded this. It was largely female readers reading romance fiction on Kindles. So it was a very different outcome. At the other extreme, you have books like cookbooks and travel books and children's books, which have never taken off as ebooks at all, remain under 10% in terms of their ebook sales. And then somewhere in the middle, between 15 and 20%, you will have the nonfiction books like history, business, and economics, and biography and autobiography, and so on. So you have a very wide distribution of patterns in terms of ebook sales that remain concealed if you just look at average numbers.
What I have heard is that numbers are roughly between 15 and 20% of revenues.
That's correct.
That's what
It is about right. And because what's happening now is that ebooks are declining as a percentage of overall sales for many trade publishers. Not declining steeply, but gently declining. But what you have happening is that in place of ebook sales, you see a surge in audiobook sales. And audiobook sales also are digital sales because
Yes.
they're overwhelmingly digital downloads. And so the category of digital sales is remaining pretty stable at between around 20% for many mainstream trade publishers. But the composition of the digital category is changing. Ebooks are declining somewhat, and audiobooks are becoming more significant as a digital sale.
And audiobooks have enjoyed this sort of double-digit increase annually over the last number of years, primarily because of what? Mobile phones or what?
Yeah.
What's the reason?
There are technological conditions, and there are also probably social conditions relevant in trying to explain the surge of audiobooks. So the technical conditions are twofold. One is that the business of audiobooks began to see from around 2005 on that there was an opportunity for audiobooks by using MP3 files and making them downloadable. Because audiobooks are not new. They have been around since the 1950s. They were created and consumed using, well, first of all, vinyl LPs, and then using cassettes, and then using CDs, and so on and so forth. So they were using other media. But in the early 2000s, it was clear that there were opportunities in the late 1990s, early 2000s. It became clear that there were opportunities for making audiobooks available as digital downloads. And this was pioneered by Audible, especially. They created a way of making audiobooks available as digital downloads that became very appealing, and they created an infrastructure for this. And of course, Audible was then bought by Amazon, which again created a very coherent technical infrastructure for consuming audiobooks, makes it very easy to consume audiobooks. What you see happening in the early 2000s is that whereas around 2000, audiobooks were overwhelmingly disseminated as CDs, by 2010, 2012, it was the digital downloads that had become the primary mode of acquiring and listening to audiobooks. So that was one part of the technical conditions. The other part was, of course, as you rightly say, the pervasive availability and use of smartphones. So a smartphone is something that you carry with you all the time. And when it becomes possible to stream on your smartphone and pick up where you left off a particular audiobook, that's really extremely convenient and very, very easy. It's much easier than having to carry a big physical apparatus around with you to play an audiobook. These were the technical conditions. The social conditions were that this is more complicated, but I think partly it's the fact that for many people, we live in a very oral and visual culture. So we watch a lot of things on a screen and we listen to a lot of things. And listening is particularly useful in many ways because it only uses a limited number of your senses. It utilizes your ears, but not your eyes and not your hands, and only part of your brain. So you can be doing lots of other things while you are listening. You can be driving, of course, which is where audiobooks were always very popular. You can be on a train. reading the newspaper or something of that kind. You can be doing the housework. You can be running or jogging or exercising at a gym. You can be doing lots of things while you are listening. Or listening to an audiobook provides the opportunity for a kind of multitasking, which fits in very well with the day-to-day flows of everyday life. People can integrate them into their everyday activities in a way you can't do with reading, because with reading, you have to sit there with your eyes focused on the text, and your hands are going to also be holding the book, and you can't really do anything else. You can't be at the gym exercising while you're reading. I mean, you could, but it's not easy to do. You can't be out jogging while you're reading. You certainly can't be driving while you're reading. So there are many things you can do listening to an audiobook that you can't do when you're reading. It liberates your senses in a way that reading doesn't. And yet it still enables you to consume the content of the book. So these are the complex technical and social conditions which have, I think, underpinned this extraordinary surge of audiobooks.
Plus the idea that you're actually putting that time to really good use. You're learning things. You're exploring new books during time that you might ordinarily have wasted.
Yes, I think that's right too. I think there are probably many factors here. I've only touched on a few of them, but you're absolutely right about that.
A few other major impacts of the digital revolution I want to just run through. One of them is print on demand, and the fact that the backlist is no longer out of print. That's huge.
It's huge. It's again one of those hidden things of the digital revolution that many outsiders would not know about. But within the book publishing industry, the emergence of print on demand has been transformative, as you rightly say. Now, it in itself is a very interesting and complex story that goes back to the 1990s, really, when technologies were developed to enable books to be printed one at a time, basically by using a kind of sophisticated photocopying machine, but that was tailored to the purposes of copying books and binding books. These technologies were developed with increasing sophistication in the course of the 1990s and early 2000s, so that questions of quality.
Who developed that?
The original origins of print on demand go back to those tech companies that needed to produce manuals for consumer goods. And that manual needed to be printed. And so they developed this print on demand technology as a way of producing manuals for consumer goods. But then it became clear that it had wider potential. And Ingram, the wholesaler, a major player in the American book business, was a very active player in the development of print on demand. And they developed a particular company, subsidiary called Lightning Source, which really pioneered much of what we now take for granted as print on demand. Now, print on demand is actually a term that covers a lot of different activities. It's at one extreme, the perfect model of print on demand is the model that says, don't print a book until you receive a customer order for it. So this is the true print on demand fulfillment system, which Lightning Source, again, was a key player in developing. So the idea here is that a publisher will produce a file for a book and will not print any book until they receive an order for it. And so rather than printing 1,000 copies and putting them in a warehouse and crossing your fingers and hoping that people would buy them, where you might be left with a lot of unsold stock if they didn't, they would produce the file, put it in a print on demand program and wait for the customer order to come in. And if an order comes in, you print it very quickly and ship it out. And therefore you don't get left with lots of unsold stock. Now that's the genuine print on demand model.
And that reduces the risk, obviously, too.
Greatly reduced the risk.
And risk is such an important concept in publishing, isn't it?
Exactly. This digital printing technology also enabled publishers to do short run digital printing, because the traditional method of printing, which is litho printing, requires a certain volume in order to make it viable economically. That is, you have to print 500 or 1,000 copies of a book in order to make it viable, because the setup costs are very expensive to get everything set up on the equipment before you start printing the books. Costs you quite a lot, and therefore you have to have a high print run to make it viable. But with digital printing, if you can print 50 copies and still have a good unit cost, then you're able to keep books in print much longer than you could if you had to print 1,000 copies. So now with digital printing, it became possible to keep books in print, reprinting much smaller numbers than it ever was before. So what you now have in this new world, this new digital world, is a kind of hybrid printing environment where publishers will often print the first print run, maybe the second or the third or the fourth print run using traditional litho printing, where they are printing large numbers of books and therefore getting a good unit cost. But as the sales begin to decline over time, in the old days, it would have come a point where they would simply put that book out of print. Now they simply make a decision at some point, well, we'll simply print smaller numbers using digital printing. If the sales are very low, they'll simply say, well, we'll simply put this into a print on demand program whereby we don't have to make any decisions at all about whether to reprint the book. We simply wait for the orders to come in and the system will automatically print to fulfill those orders. So the result of all this is, as you rightly say, the paradoxical consequence that the digital revolution did not eliminate the printed book, but made the printed book immortal. That is, printed books exist forever now. They never go out of print because at some point they simply get put into a print on demand program and remain forever available.
And the quality of print on demand has really improved over the years too.
It has. So for most readers, you simply can't tell the difference.
Yeah,
you can't. And it would take a very trained eye to see the difference. Now, that's not entirely true if it's a heavily illustrated book, and certainly not true if it's a color illustrated book. But for most print books that are basically text on the page, you can't really tell the difference.
Another huge development has been the explosion of self-publishing.
Yes, this is in some ways the hidden continent of the modern publishing world. So again, self-publishing has a long history. It doesn't coincide with the digital revolution. It goes back to the 1920s when there were certain organizations in the publishing world who decided that they could run a business by charging authors to publish their books. This was colloquially known as Vanity Publishing. And it got a rather bad name because
there's a stigma.
There was a stigma associated with it. Vanity Publishing continued through the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and so on and so forth. It has been around for a long time. But with the digital revolution, something new happened. First of all, what happened is the use of print on demand for Vanity Publishing. So it made it possible for authors to self-publish their books, but in much lower quantities using digital printing or print on demand. And therefore, it was no longer so costly to do self-publishing. But something more fundamental happened in the early 2000s, which is that there were entrepreneurs who saw that the digital revolution opened up the possibility for a true democratization or revolution of self-publishing, where the model of self-publishing could be turned on its head. So the basic idea of this new wave of self-publishing that emerges in the early 2000s is this. Self-publishing would no longer be about charging a fee to authors to self-publish their books. Get rid of the fee. Instead, authors could self-publish their books on the platform of the self-publishing organization for free. And the publisher, the self-publishing platform, would then sell those books and pay the author if the book sold, keeping a commission for themselves to cover their costs. So this was a no fee upfront self-publishing model, completely different from the old Vanity Publishing organizations. And it was people like Robert Young at Lulu who pioneered this sort of idea, and others began to develop it, like Smashwords and so on and so forth. And in the early 2000s, this new model of the self-publishing platform gained traction and really took off. And then, of course, Amazon joined in and they created their own Kindle Direct publishing model, which was, and also a print version called Create Space. And Amazon, because they were a whole ecosystem for publishing, became a key player in the self-publishing business too.
They also included all the distribution as well, right?
Absolutely.
You didn't have to worry about much of anything other than maybe your own author appearances or whatever it would be.
That's absolutely correct. So self-publishing just exploded in the early 2000s, and now we have this enormously complex world of self-publishing, which has its own rules, has its own players, has its own conventions. And it has its own culture.
And it doesn't have the stigma.
It doesn't have the stigma. So there are many authors who actively choose to self-publish their books. They don't call themselves self-published authors. They call themselves indie authors. They wear the label indie author as a badge of honor, not as a stigma. And so it completely changed the whole culture of self-publishing. It is a dynamic, complex universe of its own that exists like a kind of parallel universe alongside the world of traditional publishing, overlapping in some ways with it, but largely independent of it.
Although it's interesting, isn't it? The sort of the dream trajectory for an author is, okay, I'll publish my own, I'll hire some freelancers, or I'll hire a service to edit and design and distribute and market. But if I get an offer from one of the traditional publishing houses, I'm jumping at that prestige.
Yes. So I say these are parallel universes that exist alongside one another. And that is an accurate characterization. But for the authors, they now have this complex space of the publishing world where there are different possible career trajectories, and they will construct their own trajectory depending on the options available to them at any particular point in time. And they may move between these universes one way or the other, depending on the opportunities that they have available. It should be said that self-publishing is creates opportunities for authors and writers that never existed before. It is a huge development, which is in many ways a greatly positive one, because it has really removed the gatekeepers of the traditional publishing world and enabled authors to publish their work, even though agents and traditional publishers turn them down. So it's a liberating development.
Also, as you suggest, we have access to all sorts of possible great works that would never previously have seen the light.
Yes. And of course, we have to remember that the gatekeepers of the traditional publishing world are just human beings, and they make some very good decisions, but they also make some mistakes. They sometimes turn things down that do end up doing very, very well. The famous example of J.K. Rowling is only one of many. Another way of looking at this is that, there are many authors who don't really know whether they can publish a book, and therefore they just do something on their own, and they create something on their own, and it turns out to have a lot of appeal. So the world of self-publishing becomes a kind of R&D space for the publishing world, where authors are experimenting with forms of writing, and they don't quite know whether it's going to be successful or appeal to readers or not. And it turns out that it does. And then maybe traditional publishers will step in and say, look, we can do something with this. So again, great examples of that would be something like Andy Weir's The Martian, which began life as a blog, and then he self-published it as a book. And it was only because a New York publisher saw that it was #1 on Amazon's science fiction bestseller list and decided that they could do something with it, that it got turned into a book by a New York publisher. And so there are many examples of how books have moved between these worlds. But there is one thing I should say that's very important here, and that is that the world of self-publishing has indeed enabled writers and authors to publish works and publish books that they never would have been able to publish before. But it's also highlighted the difference between publishing something in the sense of making it available and publishing it in the sense of making it visible and appealing to a wide readership. And this is where traditional publishers can bring something to the publishing process that many authors on their own simply can't. So the story of many authors who self-publish their books is often a story where they manage to publish it, they manage to figure out how to do it on the self-publishing platform, but then it's launched out into the world and nothing happens. Maybe they sell a few copies to friends and family, but it doesn't go much beyond that. So in other words, they don't have a support system to make their work visible, to market it effectively in a wider space. And that's where traditional publishers are able to bring something to this process that many authors can't bring to it, which is to create a market for a book, to bring it to the attention of others in a way that an author on his or her own simply can't do. So there's a very, very big difference between publishing in the sense of making available and publishing in the sense of making visible and appealing and attractive to readers. Now, having said that, it's also worth pointing out that some self-published authors do very well. Of course, many self-published books disappear without a trace, but some of them do become bestsellers. And I spend a lot of time in the book showing that by looking at some of the data on Amazon's bestseller lists. And you see that they're actually self-published books are much more significant as ebook bestsellers than many outsiders would ever think.
Yes, you talked to Data Guy.
Well, Data Guy, a very intriguing figure in the world of publishing, was someone who was he's a software engineer, worked in Silicon Valley for a games company, and was accustomed to scraping data from the internet in order to analyze sales numbers. And so he took an interest in figuring out what was actually happening to self-published books. He himself also was a indie author, so he had a particular interest in figuring out what was going on with self-published books. Trouble with Amazon is that they don't tell you any sales figures, so you don't know what's happening in terms of sales from Amazon. You can't figure it out. Many people had assumed that actually, although hundreds of thousands of books were being self-published through Amazon's Kindle Direct and through other self-publishing organizations like Smashwords and so on, many people assumed that all or nearly all of these books were simply disappearing without a trace and selling in very small numbers, and that all the reasonably selling books, best-selling books, and strongly selling books would be the books that are being published by traditional mainstream publishers. Data Guy wasn't so sure, so he did something very interesting, which was to scrape tons of data from Amazon's bestseller lists and then analyze which of those bestsellers were books published by mainstream publishers and which were self-published books. And he was able to show that self-published books feature among Amazon's ebook bestsellers much more significantly than anyone had previously thought. So that was really a serious eye-opener. And of course, it's also important to stress that the really successful self-published ebooks tend to be in those categories of genre fiction that we spoke about earlier, like in romance, sci-fi, thrillers, and so on.
Well, and this is what you do throughout the book, which makes it very readable. And that is that you identify individuals and you follow their successes and failures in crowdfunding, for example. There's a chapter on you call book flicks, where Scribd is described, the company that tries to do a Spotify version of books. And you also talk about Wattpad and how they've sort of flipped this whole risk scenario on its head. I thought that was fascinating.
Well, you've raised many interesting questions there. So let me just pick up two things from what you've said. First, the methodological point you're making. For me, this is really, really important. So when we try to think about the impact of new technologies, of technological change, we have a great tendency in our culture to focus on the successes, to focus on the Googles and the Amazons and the Microsofts and the Facebooks and the Twitters of this world, and to focus on the great successes, and to wipe out all those great ideas and projects that never succeeded. And yet the truth is that the successes are a small fraction of all the initiatives that are undertaken. And so it's like writing the history of war only from the perspective of the victors, and never thinking about all the other players that are involved in these struggles that occur historically. And so what I wanted to do was to go back through this historical process of the digital transformation of the publishing industry and look at what was happening at the time from the perspective of the players in it, what they were seeking to do, what their aims were, how they had tried to realize it, and what happened to their dreams over time. Some of them succeeded and some of them failed. And we learn as much from the failures as we learn from the successes. So we can't just eliminate.
What did you learn from the failures then?
Well, we learn, for example, why you were able to succeed at this particular activity and not at that one.
Why did you fail?
Yes, well, why did you fail? So we could look at a number of those. But if we looked at, for example, the subscription services for ebooks, now that's a perfect example because we had two key players launched at the same time. We had Scribd on the West Coast and we had Oyster on the East Coast. Both started within a month of one another with the same idea to create a subscription service for books, much like Netflix for films and Spotify for music. Those were their models. And they both started the same way. They developed their own platforms. They were competing head to head with one another. And one of them succeeded, Scribd, and the other failed, Oyster. So if we just focused on Scribd, we wouldn't understand why the other had failed. So if we look at both of them and their parallel paths, we can understand why they failed.
So why did Oyster fail?
Well, they didn't fail for the reason you might think. Everyone assumed that the reason they failed was because the business model that subscription services and ebooks were forced to use by the publishers, which was what I call a threshold model. This is becoming rather technical, but becoming a threshold model was such that the margin was too small for the organization to succeed. So that was the assumption. That was the view that most people, that's why Oyster failed. But in fact, that's not the case. The reason why Oyster failed was primarily because they were spending far too much money to try to acquire their customers. So the cost of customer acquisition was way too high. Whereas Scribd was able to leverage the fact that it had a large customer base already that they could market the subscription to service to very cheaply. But the cost of acquisition per customer was very low. So that was the real reason to explain the success of Scribd.
Didn't they also limit the number of books you could read to 3 or 4 a month?
They did. They did have to introduce various measures to restrict usage. You're absolutely right. And they had also to remove a large part of romance fiction because it was costing them way too much money. So they did take various other steps of that kind. But the reason that Oyster failed was not for that reason. The reason they failed was because the cost of acquisition of their customers was far too high, and therefore their funding was not renewed. That is, they were reliant on venture capital funding, and that was not renewed. So this is an example, just one of many examples to show why it's important to look at the failures as well as the successes. And in relation to that, I also was very concerned not just to tell a dry technological history, focusing on the technologies, which again is very common in writing histories of technology, that you just focus, for example, on the technical features of the ebook and so on and so forth. I wanted to show that technologies exist in relation to flesh and blood human beings who have projects and who have dreams and see opportunities and want to develop those opportunities. And so you have to put technologies in context where there are real human beings who have resources and opportunities and dreams and ideas and set about in order to realize those dreams. Some succeed and others fall by the wayside and fail. But I wanted to put the human beings back in the picture.
That's exactly what publishers need to do when they're selling their books to readers.
That's true. They do. And I think you're right. I mean, it's again, putting human beings back into the picture is absolutely critical. And, Amazon's algorithmic marketing is never going to do that. You're never going to talk to a human being in that system. But I think putting human beings back into the process is really, really important. You're absolutely right about that.
I don't want to dwell on the technical side, but there's one term that you use that I think bears a bit of attention, and that is the agency model when publishers are dealing with Amazon.
Yes.
Could you just outline that for us, please?
Sure. So the traditional way in which publishers sell books to retailers is called the wholesale model. And the way the wholesale model works, it's very simple. And that is that a publisher says the price of the book, let's say the price of the book is $20, and I'm going to give you a discount of 50%. So the retailer will pay the publisher $10 for the book, and they will have $10 that they can use for their own overheads. They will sell it for $20, and they will have that $10 for the retailer. So this traditional wholesale model is very common in the industry, and the discount can be set at different levels. So it could be set at 50%, or it could be set at 40%, or it could be set at 30%. It could be set at 32%. It can be set at many different levels. And most publishers will have a range of discounts that they use, and they will allocate a particular discount to a particular book depending on the kind of book it is. So for a mainstream trade book, they will often give 50% discount. For a book that is maybe more professional or more scholarly, they might give a discount of only 30% or 32%. So they will have a set of different discounts, and they will use them in this way. Now, for a retailer like Barnes & Noble or a independent bookstore, most generally they will only take books that have a full trade discount because their overheads are quite high. They've got all that real estate, they have all those salaries they have to pay, and therefore they need a substantial discount in order to be able to make enough money to carry the books. So that's the way the traditional model works. Now, when it comes to ebooks, when ebooks began to take off from 2007, 2008 on with the development of the Kindle, publishers were initially using the wholesale model. They might have said, for example, okay, the print book is $20. The ebook, I'm going to set the digital list price of the ebook at, say, maybe $15 or $16, a little bit lower. And then I'm going to give the retailer a discount. Let's say it's going to be 50% discount. So maybe if they set the digital list price at $16 and they give a 50% discount, the retailer paid $8 for each of those ebooks. Now, Amazon really liked this model of the wholesale model for the very simple reason that a wholesale model allows the retailer to discount. If it's a print book, selling at $20 and the retailer has a discount of 50%, so they're paying $10, they might sell the book to the customer not at $20 but at $15, and therefore they give up half of their discount and pass it on to the consumer. Or they might even very aggressively have a promotion where they sell it at $12. And so they're only making $2 on every sale, but they're being very aggressive, treating it like a loss leader in order to really promote. So if this was a book by, say, Dan Brown or something like that, the retailers would compete on their discounting.
Yeah.
Now, Amazon liked this because Amazon liked to discount.
That's what put the indies, a lot of them, out of business.
Exactly. It's very difficult for the indies to do this discounting because they have their staff costs and they're not big organizations, so they need to make enough of a margin on every sale in order to to pay the rent and to pay the salaries. But with Amazon, it was very different because they didn't have bookstores, and therefore they weren't paying real estate for physical stores. They had other costs like postage costs and things like that and staff costs, but they didn't have real estate costs in the same way, apart from their warehouses. So it's a very different situation. But Amazon, when it came to ebooks, Amazon was very keen to keep the wholesale model because when they launched the Kindle in November 2007, they wanted to be able to persuade people to buy the Kindle, which was quite a big investment, maybe $300 or something. And they wanted to be able to say, look, when you buy the Kindle, you can get all these great books like New York Times bestsellers at $9.99, very cheaply. Amazon would discount heavily these ebooks in order to make the ebook reader, the Kindle, seem even more attractive because it wanted to get market share. This was at the early stages of the competition for ebooks, and getting market share was absolutely critical because the thing about ebooks is that you have a proprietary device. And therefore, when someone has bought the Kindle, they're going to stay with the Kindle. They're not going to suddenly go to Kobo or something like that. They're a Kindle user. And therefore, once they're in the system, they're locked in the system. So it was crucial for Amazon to build market dominance very quickly. And discounting heavily ebooks was a key way to do it. However, publishers were not at all happy with this procedure because they feared in 2007, 2008, 2009 that pricing this content at $9.99 would devalue the book, would make consumers feel that books were only worth $9.99, just like a song was only worth 99 cents in the Amazon
and they
iTunes
weren't going to
store.
pay more.
And they weren't going to pay more. It would change their expectation of what the price and the value of that book really was. And so they were very unhappy about this. And moreover, publishers, they were fearful that this would undercut the market for the print book, which was really important for them because they were, especially with bestsellers, they were heavily exposed as organizations because they had paid very high advances. And therefore, they needed to sell a lot of books in order to recover those advances. And so they were very unhappy with this high discounting model. And therefore, publishers decided, whether it was one by one or whether they discussed it is a moot point, and they were sued for this. But just without going into that story, they decided that it would be better to use what they called an agency model, which was the model that Apple used in the iTunes store. So the agency model basically says this. What the publisher does is the publisher fixes the price of the ebook. Say the ebook is $16.99. That's the price of the ebook. The publisher can say, this is the price. And the retailer gets a 30% commission or agency fee for selling the book. So the publisher only gets $16.99 less 30% is what goes back to the publisher. The retailer keeps the 30%. But, and this is the twist, the retailer cannot discount. It has to be sold at $16.99 because the publisher set the price. So the first publisher to say to Amazon that they were going to change the model for ebooks from the wholesale model to the agency model was Macmillan.
You tell the story of John Sargent flying out to Seattle, right?
That's right. So he flew out to Seattle to announce to Amazon as a gentlemanly thing to do. I'm not going to just tell you in an email. I'm going to come out and see you and tell you face to face. And they unceremoniously showed him to the door.
Yeah.
And, they were not at all happy with this change. And this was the beginning of the price war, the very aggressive, intensive price war around ebook pricing that broke out at that time and that ended up in the courts.
Yeah. And of course, it's just a battle for control of who gets to price it.
Exactly. It's a battle for control of who gets to price it, but it's also more fundamentally, I think, it's not just a battle about pricing. It's a battle about the value of the content.
Yes.
Because the important thing to see here is that from the publisher's point of view, content is everything. Publishers are involved, like authors, in the creation and cultivation of content. It's about what the book says.
Yeah.
And that is everything. And that's an expensive business because it takes time for authors to write books, and it takes time and salaries for publishers to create and produce books and design them and so on and so forth. So it's all about the content. Whereas for a retailer and an intermediary like Amazon, it's not about the content. It's about the volume. It's about getting as many consumers into your system as you can possibly get into your system so that you are the dominant player, that you have market share.
So that you can surveil them too.
Yes, but content becomes a means to another end. And
Yes.
the end is the volume of consumers that are using your system. You use the content in order to achieve another end. But the result is that the content in this case is devalued. It's sold cheaply in order to secure another goal.
Yeah.
And the danger here is that the value is therefore drained out of the system. In a very similar way to you had in the music industry, where the revenues collapsed in the music industry. The fear in the publishing world was the same thing was going to happen. So it's about different ways of thinking of the value of content. That's fundamentally what it's about.
Okay, so one final anecdote. I loved it. It was in one of your many fascinating footnotes, and it had to do with the copyright of backlists, which weren't dealt with between 1923 and 1994. And you reference what the agent Andrew Wiley did. Perhaps you could tell that story.
Okay, this is a complex situation that emerged early in the history of the development of ebooks, which is that there were some individuals who saw that with the development of ebooks, a new set of opportunities was emerging that publishers had not properly prepared themselves for. Because ebooks didn't exist in the past. They didn't exist prior to, the early 1990s. They were just a kind of idea. And so publishers' contracts had never really built in the possibility or the idea that they needed to stipulate very clearly and unambiguously who had the rights on ebooks. This idea only began to emerge in the early 1990s. And so in around 1994, publishers realized that there was a gap in their contracts. And so they began to rewrite their contracts to add a new clause that explicitly said that the publisher had ebook rights. From 1994 to 2000, publishers were busily rewriting their contracts and also doing something else, which was to approach authors and estates of books they had published to say, we would like to negotiate with you the ebook rights for these books.
And there were a couple of interesting companies that you profiled too.
There were two in particular. Rosetta Books was one. Arthur Klebanov, who'd been an agent, saw this gap And he saw, all right, there's an opportunity to hoover up all the digital rights on these backlist books that had not been tied down in publishers' contracts. And Jane Friedman, who had been a publisher at HarperCollins, she also saw this opportunity, and she started her company called Open Road Media using the same model. They tried to build businesses which were essentially backlist ebook businesses, hoovering up the rights between 1923. Prior to 1923, it was public domain. So it was between 1923 and 1994. That was the space. And there were a lot of books in that space. That's the space where the fight for the backlist ebook rights was waged. Those were two companies. There were others, but those two I really focus on because they were among the most innovative in the way they developed these businesses.
They won some court cases too.
And they won some because they were sued. Both of them were sued. In the case of Arthur Klebanov, he demonstrated that there really was a gap there, that if publishers had not explicitly tied down those rights, they were open. And so, as I say, publishers did actively seek to close down that gap. Now, the story with Andrew Wiley is related to this, but it's slightly different. Andrew Wiley is one of the most famous New York literary agents, very well known in the industry for his aggressive style.
I've tried to get him on this podcast quite a few times.
You have. Well, he's an extremely articulate man, very smart, very, very sharp. He met his equal in the struggle over ebook rights. The background to this story is that Andrew Wiley is very much of the view that the royalties on ebooks should be higher than what has become the industry norm. When ebooks began to take off, there was much debate about how much royalty authors should be paid on ebook sales. And it ranged everything from 10% at the low end to 50% at the high end, maybe even higher. And what happened in the industry is that it settled at around 25%. Andrew Wiley always believed it should be higher than that, more like 50%. And so he was fighting with publishers about the royalty rate on ebooks. And he wasn't making a lot of progress. And so he decided to simply publish the books themselves as ebooks. And he started a publishing house called Odyssey Editions in order to make his point to publishers that, well, if they're not going to give higher royalties on ebooks, then he will publish them.
He published some big names.
He did. Philip Roth, Saul Bellow, John Updike. I mean, these are well-known figures. And he simply said, all right, if you're not going to give me a higher royalty, then I'm going to publish them myself. Well, what happened, he didn't really expect this to happen, but he was on holiday, summer holiday, and he got a phone call that Random House, as it was at the time, was not going to do business with him anymore. They felt he didn't have a right to do this. And I don't think Andrew entirely expected that move, that counter move in the chess game. It was a rather effective counter move in the chess game. It brought Andrew to the table. They reached an agreement behind closed doors, and Odyssey Editions was effectively frozen from that point on.
So again, you've got to love the chutzpah.
Yeah, exactly. But so it's a slightly different story because it's really a new move in an old game of the kind of negotiations, sometimes tense, sometimes acrimonious, between agents and publishers about terms. And this was using the new digital environment to make a move in this old game that eventually did reach a resolution that was different from what it had been at the outset. So it wasn't entirely a useless move, but it didn't go exactly the way that I think Andrew expected it to go.
Okay, just finally, the book Book Wars is described as a foundation for all future thinking about book publishing. Two questions based on all of this research that you've done. What does a book publisher today have to do to survive and thrive over the next 10 years?
The good news is that book publishing has come through the first 3 to 4 decades of the digital revolution remarkably well. There were many prophets of doom who said around late 1990s, early 2000s that the book publishing industry was finished, goodbye Gutenberg and all of that. I can't tell you how many books I've read on the end of the book.
Yeah.
Many, many books, as you know, have argued that books are going to disappear. And indeed, other industries like the music industry and the newspaper industry have had a very, very rough time coming to terms with the digital revolution. So the book publishing industry, by contrast, has weathered the storm remarkably well. It has not collapsed as an industry. Books are still very much with us. Even the old-fashioned print on paper book is very much with us. So I think that's a good story. There is still a real desire in our societies to read books and to read books on paper. This augurs well for the book publishing industry.
What do they have to do to thrive?
They need to be thinking very creatively about how they reposition themselves in a new kind of information and communication space where people are interacting with one another and acquiring information in new ways. And this means, to begin with, some of the things we spoke about earlier. That is, they have to see that they're not just dealing with other businesses like retailers. They have to reach out to their readers in a way that they have never done before. They have to reach out using the new tools of our new digital age in order to interact with and facilitate interaction with all those millions of people in the world who still love books and are interested in books. And this requires complete re-engineering of many publishing organizations. Doesn't come naturally to publishers to be thinking about readers. They just don't think about readers very much. And so they have to really rethink what they're doing. And I think they also have to think fundamentally about the kinds of tools they use and methods they use to make visible their books and to publicize their books throughout this new space of information and communication flows that we live in today. The old methods aren't going to work anymore. They can't just rely on advertising or expecting to get reviews in book review media, because many of those book review media don't exist anymore. There are other ways that people are finding out about books, and publishers have to be very creative and imaginative in thinking about how to insert their books in those communication flows, whether they are on social media or whether they are on blogs or whether they are on other forms of communication network that exist and are proliferating in this new space. So a lot of rethinking needs to take place in these ways.
Okay, last request. And I know you're not going to like this, but in 5 years, what's the breakdown going to be among print, ebook, and audio sales percentages in 5 years?
I take the view that that kind of future prediction is a waste of time. And we only have to look at how hopelessly people tried to do this in the early 2000s to see what a waste of time it is. So I really don't wish to suggest this. I would, in response to your question, first of all, it's not going to be a simple pattern. One of the things we saw very clearly from ebooks is that it's going to vary enormously from type of book. So it depends on what kind of books you're publishing. If you're in the romance fiction business, I would say your ebook sales are going to continue to grow, and probably audiobooks are going to grow phenomenally fast, because that's where you see real growth in audiobooks, is in genre fiction. Print is probably going to continue to decline. On the other hand, if you're in the serious nonfiction business, it's going to be a very different picture. You're going to see probably a fairly stable ebook performance. It may not decline greatly. It may not increase greatly. It'll probably remain around 20%. Audiobooks might grow a bit, but probably not phenomenally, because that's not a growth area in audiobooks. And print will remain the cornerstone of your business in 5 years. It's not going to change very much. Probably 80% of your business will be in print. And audiobooks will be small, but growing, but small. It probably just compensate for the slight decline in ebooks. If you're in children's publishing, it's probably going to be completely different again. And much there might depend on what kind of technological innovations come along in terms of, new forms of content delivery and so on. But there we've seen ebooks remain very low. Audiobooks might also, and there could be some development of audiobooks, especially if you get certain kinds of narrators narrating children's books. I mean, so that could be a growth area, but it's going to be, again, very different picture from, say, romance or genre fiction publishing.
The fun part of publishing is that you really don't have a clue what's going to go crazy. You put them out there and you hope that one of them makes a big bang, and you're proud of putting the rest of them out.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, there's a very large element of serendipity in this business, and that's not going to go away. It's going to continue to be like that. The point to stress here is that, one of the things I tried to show in the book, and that you have brought out in your questions, is that this is a much more complicated space than anyone might have thought. There are many different forms of publishing, and what happens in any particular small sector of this space can be very different from what happens in another sector of this space. And to try to generalize across it all with some sweeping generic number or percentage point is not telling you very much, actually. You have to dig down and see that what happens in, say, genre fiction publishing or romance publishing is going to be a very different experience from what happens in children's books publishing, let alone in academic publishing or professional publishing, where the pattern is going to be completely different again.
Well, years ago, when I used to go over to Europe, I used to pick up copies of The Economist to read on the airplane when I went over. And after I'd read some of those on the trip, my brain always felt good. I always felt like I had all sorts of really good information that I could share with my friends over in Europe. And that's the same kind of feeling I have here, having read your book. It's just chock full of really interesting, granular information. And it was a pleasure to read. So a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for sharing this with me.
Thank you, Nigel, and a great pleasure for me too. Your questions are really probing and thoughtful, and I enjoyed addressing them.
Very good. John B. Thompson is the author of Book Wars, The Digital Revolution in Publishing, and that is published by Polity Books?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, is that worldwide rights?
It is worldwide.
Okay. Thanks again for your time.
Thank you very much, Nigel. Thank you.